In part 3 of this Ross Sea Voyage series, we transit the Bellingshausen Sea to reach the very remote and infrequently visited Peter I Island. We take a flight-seeing trip over Peter I Island and then transit the Amundsen Sea to reach the fabled Ross Sea. At the end of part 2, we left behind the Antarctic Peninsula with its waters filled with feeding whales and started our transit across the Bellingshausen Sea to Peter I Island. As we sailed across the Bellingshausen Sea, we started to see a parade of huge icebergs passing by. The huge icebergs came in every imaginable shape and size, with some being truly fantastic in form. In the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic ice sheet is the chief source of icebergs. Scientists estimate that the lifespan of an iceberg is being about 3,000 years, from first snowfall on a glacier till final melting when the ocean currents carry them into the warmer waters. The huge icebergs stood out on the ship's radar. Finally, we were nearing the Antarctic Circle at a latitude of 66 degrees 33 minutes and 39 seconds south of the equator. Within the Antarctic Circle, all places have 24 hours of daylight on summer solstice in December, whilst in June, on the winter solstice, all places have 24 hours of darkness. Finally, after 2 days of transiting across the Bellingshausen Sea, the ship's charting system showed that we were only 2.5 hours from Peter I Island, which lies 450 kilometers or 280 miles off the coast of Antarctica. As well as melting in warmer waters, icebergs are relentlessly subjected to the action of waves, which adds to the berg's erosion. We arrived off Peter I Island at 8 p.m., but as there was close to 24 hours of daylight, a landing was still a possibility. The weather conditions were surprisingly good when we first arrived, so the chance of landing on the island seemed good. However, the expedition leader dithered about what to do, and after several hours of inaction, the conditions were no longer favorable for landing, so we settled for a helicopter flypast of the island. This outcome was very disappointing for passengers whose goal was to land on this remote island. The island is dominated by a huge dormant volcano called Lars Christiansen Peak, which soars to a height of 1,640 meters or 5,380 feet above sea level. It was named after the whaler ship owner Lars Christiansen, who financed the 1929 Norwegian expedition which claimed the island for Norway. A helicopter was sent on recce before flight-seeing operations started. With a landing on Peter I Island off the table, the plan became simply to fly along the coast of the island. The helicopter on the landing pad was flown off for a reconnaissance flight, whilst the remaining 2 helicopters in the hangar were dragged out and their rotor blades installed for flight. It would take 4 hours to wrap up flight-seeing operations, so there was plenty of time to keep an eye out for activity around the island.
Sorry, which side? Left side, right side?
Right side. I was going to say down.
Nearly all of the island is covered by a glacier, and it is surrounded most of the year by pack ice, making it inaccessible during these times. Hence, the island is very rarely visited, let alone landed upon. Peter I Island is a 156 square kilometer or 60 square mile uninhabited volcanic island claimed as a dependency by Norway. The island was first sighted by the Russian Bellingshausen expedition in 1821, which named it for Tsar Peter I of Russia. However, it was not until over 100 years later, in 1929, that the first landing was made by a Norwegian expedition which claimed it for Norway. Peter I Island is nearly 95% glaciated, with ice fields reaching down to the sea almost all the way around the island, although there are 3 small rocky beaches where zodiacs may make a hazardous landing. Finally, it was our turn to board the next helicopter for a 15-minute flight along the coast of Peter I Island, but unfortunately there'd be no landing. Our aerospatiale écureuil, or squirrel helicopter, carried 5 passengers in total, with 4 in the rear and 1 in the co-pilot seat. Fortunately, I scored the co-pilot seat, so had a good view during the flight compared to those sitting in the middle seats in the rear. Our helicopter ride took us over icebergs, humpback whales, and along the coast to see the rugged glaciated island up close. The cloud deck was low, but on the horizon we could see a band of red produced as the sun was slowly setting, going on 11 p.m. Flew over an iceberg with what looked like an aquamarine swimming pool in it, but of course a person wouldn't last long in the cold Antarctic waters. The glaciers that reached down to the ocean routinely calved icebergs, which were scattered in the waters around the island. Fortunately for all on board, I resisted the urge to start flying the helicopter from the co-pilot seat. The deep crevasses in the glaciers foreshadowed the calving of more new icebergs. As we turned away from the coast and headed back to the ship, we could see how small our ship looked from a bird's eye view. As we flew back to the ship, we could see a whale near a huge iceberg. The large whale looked so small compared to the ginormous iceberg. Although the short flights only lasted 15 minutes, it took 4 hours using 3 helicopters until the flight seeing operation ended at 1 a.m. Back on board, we could resume watching the whales diving to feed near the iceberg until all the flights were over and the helicopters safely stowed back on board for continuance of our voyage southwards. With the helicopters stored back on board, we sailed from Peter I Island southwards towards the Bay of Whales in the Ross Sea. Soon after departing Peter I Island, we encountered an area of brash ice, but we were still well outside the outer edge of the summer sea ice extent. We'd enter into the summer sea ice days later as we tried to navigate into the Bay of Whales. Crab-eater seals took advantage of the far offshore brash ice to rest. However, the ocean swells made their ice pans move impressively up and down, which may have been either relaxing or annoying. The crab-eater seal is the most abundant seal species in the world, with population estimates ranging as high as 75 million individuals. Despite its name, crab-eater seals do not eat crab. Rather, they have specialized teeth to strain krill from the water. Although it was always interesting to watch our ship force its way through the brash ice, this significantly slowed down the ship's progress and served to reduce our time available to explore the Ross Sea. Soon we exited the area of brash ice and re-entered the open ocean, and the parade of huge icebergs resumed. It was interesting to see what, if anything, would emerge into view from behind one of the huge icebergs. Sometimes, another more distant iceberg would emerge. One of the huge icebergs had a patch of smooth ice on its rugged surface that looked remarkably like a map of North America. Some of the icebergs were tilting and approaching the point at which they'd roll over. Leaving the Bellingshausen Sea, we entered the Amundsen Sea, which was named by the Norwegian expedition of 1929 in honor of the Norwegian polar explorer Roald Amundsen, who in 1911 was the first to reach the South Pole. In this part of the Amundsen Sea, huge icebergs filled the ship's radar screen. When the sun was shining, it was very nice to be out on the deck watching the brightly illuminated parade of icebergs pass by.
You see the birds on the iceberg there?
The shape of some of the icebergs was fantastical, and even though they were huge, it was only a matter of time until they broke apart and melted away in the warmer waters that they were slowly being carried towards. Occasionally, we'd be lucky to pass by some active humpback whales blowing and sounding in the Amundsen Sea that was dotted with huge icebergs. As the sun set after midnight, we passed by a huge iceberg that resembled an aircraft carrier. In front of this huge aircraft carrier of an iceberg, there was a pod of humpback whales blowing and sounding. Their blows looked like spouts of gold in the golden glow at sunset. The final act of this wonderful sunset was a golden sun sliding down behind the clouds on the horizon. Overnight there was a light snowfall that changed the look of the deck and also made it slippery. In part 4 of this series, we sailed to the end of the Bay of Whales, which marks our closest approach to the South Pole. We then make the long 600-kilometer transit along the front of the Ross Ice Shelf to McMurdo Sound, where we spend days exploring and making landings in this deep part of Antarctica.
Take me somewhere nice, to some tired island